Hey everybody, my name is Rebecca Scroggy. I am a registered nurse and an IBCLC, but probably most importantly, I am a mom to two kids. I am so beyond thrilled to be here with you and share some amazing superstar interviews with you all. We will be going over amazing topics like lactation, postpartum mental health, pelvic floor, and so much more. Just to make sure you don't miss anything, make sure to hit subscribe and follow us on all of our socials. We'll link them below. And as always, we want to know what you want to hear. So comment below any topics that you'd like us to cover. So now that we got that over with, here we go. You are our first interview with Chillin with Ceres Chill. And so I am so excited to have you be our first one. Can you introduce yourself and share your expertise in infant feeding and emergency preparedness, which I know you have a lot of that because you were on the ground really in Western North Carolina, right?
Well, yes and no. Um, so my background is I'm one of the founders of Breastfeed Durham, and we are implementing the 10 steps to a breastfeeding family-friendly community. It's a project from the World Health Organization, the World Alliance of Breastfeeding, and the Carolina Global Breastfeeding Institute. And over the years, I'm no longer the executive director of Breastfeed Durham. I'm now the executive director of breastfeeding family-friendly communities. Last year, I became the volunteer chair of the North Carolina Breastfeeding Coalition. It's a position that rotates between different folks who do different work. And since I am based here in North Carolina, I became the chair. When the rain started falling in September, I was on a meeting from my job with 20 other counties in North Carolina and some folks from the state who are working on a project to reduce infant mortality. And I remember being on this meeting and coming off of mute, and I said, y'all, I just got a message from from my folks saying the road to Beach Mountain is completely washed out. Just like this picture of the road being gone. And then I was getting pictures of water coming into the drive-through window at a fast food restaurant over by the Biltmore. And I remember saying, like, being very panicked and saying, I think that we should address this. And I remember the speakers coming off of mute and saying, Love, we don't have anyone from Buncombe County on this call. I think we're okay to continue. And I remember thinking, no, the water runs downhill. This
Yeah,
is this is
yeah,
going to affect the whole state.
yeah.
In my experience living in Durham, the middle part of the state, we we have had many times where the beach has been hit with different storms, and all of the many folks from the coast part of North Carolina end up relocating into Durham for a few months, and it has impacts on our whole community in terms of different housing and security places. Just, I mean, for me, basic stuff like everything at the local supermarket gets sold out because there's so many extra people in the region, and it really impacts everything.
Okay, so you kind of talked a little bit about it, but why is safe infant feeding so critical in emergency situations?
So over half of the infant deaths in the globe happen during an emergency. So the time that babies are most likely to die is during an emergency. And one of the best ways to keep babies safe is to keep them with their parent. Particularly little bitties, when you're born, you don't know how to breathe, you don't know how to eat, you don't know how to regulate your body temperature. And we were designed as humans to be much better at that if we're touching one of our parents, particularly the one who birthed us, if that's available. And so, oh, particularly infants that aren't able to breast, chest, or human milk feed who are reliant on formula are additionally vulnerable because the same thing that can make formula life-saving, all the sugar and proteins, also can multiply bacteria and yeasts because of the pasteurization. It kills all the antifungal and antibacterial properties that are naturally occurring in milk. So it's one of the things that saves lives, can also put babies at risk if there's not access to clean water or refrigeration in order to keep those things safe. And babies are particularly vulnerable because their gut bacteria hasn't figured out how to combat all this stuff. And you combine that with what was happening in Western North Carolina, where the storm came in, but just days later, they were getting ice and snow. So it was really cold too. So those babies
Yeah.
had just a lot going on.
Yeah.
And particularly in Western North Carolina, the advice for pregnant folks and perinatal folks was to evacuate, which we
Yeah.
were having a really hard time with, given the pictures of the number of cars I saw turned upside down. I was like, how do you leave if your car is upside down?
Oh, yeah. Or there's no roads. How are we supposed to leave when there's no roads? Yeah. Wow. Wow. So, so in that way, like, how did you guys help those pregnant and perinatal patients? Like, I mean, what was obviously they couldn't leave, so what was the next best step for them?
I think the truth of the matter is at the beginning we didn't know what we were doing. Everybody was worried, but we couldn't get cell phone signals in and out very well.
Yeah.
My mom lives in Black Mountain. I didn't hear from her for 5 days, but we started shipping supplies to one of the other board members of the North Carolina Breastfeeding Coalition, who lives about an hour outside of Asheville. So that was became our drop zone. And then the Friday after the storm, folks outside of the city were allowed in, and she just pulled in, kind of not knowing where to go or what to do, into the birth center in Asheville, into the parking lot. The birth center was locked and closed,
Yeah.
but there were people gathered in the parking lot who had lost everything, lost spouse. One dad in particular that I actually had directed that direction, he grabbed the baby and the toddler. His spouse was grabbing the diaper bag. He ran out the door. She was behind him. She didn't make it out of the house. The house washed
Oh,
down the river. And this was an exclusively breastfed baby. And the dad was like, I don't know what to do. And I remember thinking, I don't know what to do. I haven't heard from
yeah.
anyone. I don't know where to send you. And I
Yeah.
remember saying to him, I was like, well, where did you birth?
Yeah.
Thinking like that was kind of the best thing. But remember, not even the hospital had power or water in the
Yeah.
early days after the storm.
That's so scary. I'm so glad that there were people like you guys who were able to help at least give some guidance because I know, like, in my situation, I would have been like, I just need somebody to tell me what to do. We talked a little bit about how, like, the risk of the formula. Does breastfeeding provide, like, an advantage during emergencies?
Absolutely. Is optimal infant nutrition. It definitely provides an advantage during an emergencies because it's contains customized nutrition that's made just for your baby, where any infection or any immune violators that get into your system as the parent, your body's automatically making those antibodies for the baby right away. And it doesn't require any water, it doesn't require any power. It's just there. But I always emphasize that breastfeeding is a learned behavior. Lactation is learning how to feed your infants is a learned behavior for all mammals. And if you've never seen it, then you don't know how to do it. And breastfeeding rates dropped down to 22% in 1972. So a lot of us, our moms, our grandmothers, our aunties, never were able to induce lactation, and so we're all learning it
Yeah.
right now. So it's not an easy thing to do when you just say, oh, just breastfeed. Well, it's something you learn, and there's a lot of our teachers have been
Yeah.
lost. So we are
Yeah.
relearning it as a culture together.
Yeah. That is such a true thing. I know I see that all the time in my own practice of people are like, I don't know why this is supposed to be natural. And I was like, how is it supposed to be natural if you've never seen it done before? Like, yes, it's a natural biological function, but if you've never seen it, it is a learned behavior and it is something that you have to both work on, you and babies. So, absolutely. Now, I know that, like, especially on the interwebs, we see moms who, and we know that stress can cause issues with milk supply. And obviously, being in an emergency situation, that's going to be very stressful. So, what kind of advice do you have if a breastfeeding mom is feeling stressed or struggling to breastfeed during a crisis?
So I think that's complicated. I would say
Yeah.
that stress can be an inhibitor to having your milk let down. But
Yeah.
the way that breast milk works is it's supply and demand. So the more that comes out, the more your body will make. The biggest reasons we saw families, their supply drop during the emergency is because they were dehydrated or because they weren't eating enough. And you can imagine when there's no clean water, it can be really difficult to stay hydrated. But a lot of folks were seeing problems with the parent. So they were offering problems with breastfeeding. So they were offering supplementation to the baby. And I kept thinking, like, if you could just take all that stuff that you're trying to give
Yeah.
to the baby and give it to the mama, it's like a 2-for-1 deal.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. So true. Oh my gosh, yeah. And I mean, like, I guess in that situation, like, what kind of resources would you think would be able to find that water, the clean water? I mean, is that just like local organizations?
Local organizations were there. I am going to say the name of a brand because I don't know their competitor, but the Life Straw is always a
Hmm.
good idea, or one of those competitor products. And then being able to sanitize water just with bleach, you can actually put in a small amount of bleach and then it can become drinkable. So
Oh,
all of those are options. And of course, if you have access to power, boiling the water is
yeah,
a great option as well.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this one's kind of a fun one. Is there any myths that you have heard of, which I'm sure you have, about breastfeeding in emergencies that you would like to disprove?
I think the biggest myth I've always heard is that like your milk will turn sour if you've experienced stress, or something will happen to your milk if you're experiencing
Yes.
stress. And I'm like, well hydrated mamas, parents who are going to make beautiful milk. We see this all
Yeah,
the time in countries that experience disaster all the time. If you're hydrated, your body can make beautiful milk, even if you're not well nourished.
yeah,
Typically your body can still make beautiful milk. And I think the biggest for me, the biggest challenge is we all want to send whenever an emergency happens. So often in North Carolina, first the floodwaters came, and the next flood was the flood of formula,
yeah,
and the Appalachian region had one of the highest breastfeeding rates in the state, and it really is the safest option. And one of the ways to be helpful, sending a baby carrier would have been a lot more helpful than sending formula.
yeah,
Sending diapers is helpful, but oftentimes supplemental nutrition, because of those risks, it's not often helpful. And there's so much of it actually has gone bad because facilities haven't been able to safely store it, because
yeah,
infant nutrition has to be temperature controlled. It can't get too hot or too cold. And we saw both happening in Western
yeah.
North Carolina.
Especially with all the snowstorms and the ice storms that we've had. I mean, I'm in Kentucky, so a little bit close to where you guys are. And I know that it was miserable here, and I couldn't have imagined, being on the ground with, no housing and trying to figure out how to store all that stuff. And then I know just from like working with you all and stuff that expiration dates was a big issue too, right? People sending expired formula.
I mean, in my opinion, I feel like it was not people who were sending expired
Mhm.
formula. I often feel like it might have been companies that were sending
Okay.
expired formula.
Yeah.
And we also, if we have to provide supplemental nutrition to an infant, the single serving ready to feed is the ideal environment, especially if you're talking about a region where the power hasn't turned back on yet. And a lot of people thought that we were silly, because I was like, don't send the powder, don't send the giant
Yeah.
containers.
Yeah.
But I was like, because and they need a clean nipple with every single one of them, so they can just
Mhm.
use it and throw it away. But if you think about an environment where you can't wash your hands, you can't wash a baby bottle, you can't put anything in the fridge, those single serving ready to feed were really designed for exactly this situation.
In an emergency, how can people safely prepare and store formula when clean water is not available, electricity might be limited or not available? Like, I know you guys have done the safe infant feeding kit, so is that kind of built for that?
Absolutely. Our safe infant feeding kits are built for that. And if you are able to take water and you put it into the bucket, and you want to add just a tiny little bit of bleach to the water and wash it with soap and water and wash everything just like you were washing it at your kitchen sink. And then dump that out and put back in clean water and add additional bleach. And then you can bleach all of your items, let them sit for 5 minutes, and then hang them out to dry or lay them someplace clean to dry, which we feel like that was the biggest challenge, is like, where is clean when the whole
Yeah.
world's been contaminated? So if you have a mesh bag, that can be a really good option. And a lot of folks ended up using, if you were still in your home, laundry bags that are were
Oh,
mesh, or
yeah.
go, and for me in my household, that would be, I would have to go dig into my camping gear and think about my kids that are in scouts or places like that.
Yeah.
Or some people were using clothespins and literally hanging up infant feeding supplies with clothespins on the clothesline
Yeah.
to be able to keep it clean and safe.
I think
But
if I had to find a mesh bag, I would end up using like a bra bag that I have for the
mhm,
laundry because I
yeah.
think that's the only mesh bag that I have
Right.
in
But
my.
because of during the emergency, the septic tanks were swept down the river as
Yeah.
well, and then they exploded and they aerosoled across the community. So
Wow.
all of people's towels and their dishcloths and things weren't really clean anymore. So that was the thing where you had to remember, you got to wash everything. You have to wash the
Yeah.
towel, you have to wash the dishcloth, you have to wash the bottle brush, and sanitize everything to start over again.
Okay, so hypothetically, if a mom was not breastfeeding and baby was formula fed and an emergency happened and no longer had access to safe formula use, what is the other best alternative?
Another safe alternative would be donor milk, or
Mhm.
having someone breastfeed your baby is another
Yeah.
wonderful option if it's somebody you trust. Obviously, there are some diseases that can pass through breast milk, so you would want to look for things like syphilis, hepatitis, those sorts of things. But for me, when during an emergency, if I'm leaving my house, I know my neighbors, I know my family, I know my sister, and
Yeah.
those are the kinds of folks that I would feel comfortable with. And one of the things that we have worked on with the SAFE team is the Appalachian region has one of the highest statistics for folks that are informally sharing milk. There's formal milk sharing through a milk bank where the milk is tested, but in the Appalachian region, folks have been sharing milk for a long time. And I'm from rural Tennessee originally, and my great grandmother, always talked about how the folks in their community saved his life because he was a 2 pound preemie, and they had all the neighbors donate milk. And this was back when people were hand expressing into containers.
Yeah.
But that kind of culture is deeply steeped in the Appalachian culture. So one of the things that we've been working with local communities that were informally milk sharing anyway is having disclosure forms, so that you on the with a bag of milk, you're collecting the donor's name, their contact information, a little bit of history about, do they have any history of any diseases in their family that they know about, and what kind of medications are they on, and simple things where we talk about formal medications, but informal medications, like, are you drinking caffeine? Are
Yeah.
you consuming dairy? These are some of the questions that folks often have. And so
Yeah.
when you're collecting that information, with each stack of, we keep our milk, they're in the 1 to 3 ounce containers, but when we give them to families, we tend to give them in 20-ounce packs, so we wrap it with that disclosure form. So when we're informally milk sharing, we're able to say, here's the information about the person who gave the milk, and here are some links so that you can read and learn about informal milk sharing and see if it's a safe option and something you feel comfortable with you and your baby and your family. And you can call the donor and talk with them and see if this feels like the right fit. So we're just connecting families who need milk with families who have milk to give.
I love that so much. Oh, that gave me chills. That's so awesome. Okay, so we kind of talked a little bit about, like, you had said that you have in your camping kit and then these safe infant feeding kits. Um, Obviously, emergency preparedness is, I think, on a forefront of a lot of people's minds because of the devastation that happened with the hurricane and stuff like that. So, what should families include in their emergency prepared kit if they have infants that are feeding?
I think, again, if you have a breastfed infant, I would say
Mhm.
in your emergency kit, you would want to think about a baby carrier, especially if
Yeah.
you have a child all the way up through age 3. Especially in emergency, the world can become a very tricky and dangerous place. And being able to put a baby on your body so you don't have to put them down can be a really great option. I would say if you have a baby that has started to use any sort of a feeding device, a plate, a spoon, a cup, a sippy cup, if you are going to be in a situation where you might be going back to work or volunteering and you might be separated from your infant and you'll be using a breast pump or any kind of feeding devices, then you want to make sure that you have bleach, soap, and a bottle brush available. And then that mesh bag can be really handy, a container to
Yeah.
wash things in. I feel like those are the kinds of things that were easier to find.
Hmm.
In my garage, I have a bucket, but folks in shelters were really struggling with having different containers to be able to store things. And just for me, and this was one of the things I really didn't expect. For me, I always kept my baby carrier by the door when I was ready to run out the door. And I really thought, I was like, man, if there's ever emergency, that's the thing that I would really want to grab. And I think
Yeah.
that was the thing families had the hardest time finding because I feel like the bleach and the bottle brush and cleaning the supplies, that's
Mhm.
just education where you go,
Yeah.
okay, right. In an emergency, I can't just rinse out the sippy cup. I really need to wash it because that bacteria level is higher. But you're going to be able to find soap and bleach at the
Yeah.
shelters. Finding a baby carrier is harder. Finding education
Yeah.
is harder.
Oh, I can only imagine. So if you have somebody who like has maybe never used a baby carrier or has very limited knowledge about a baby carrier, is there a specific one? Because I mean, I was deep into baby carrying, like, that was one of my hyperfixations, right? And so I've had wraps, I've had structured carriers, I've had ring slings. I mean, I've had the whole gambit. So if somebody has never had that experience, they don't know what they're looking for, is there a specific kind that you would recommend?
I actually was working really hard not to recommend a specific kind because I feel like different parents like different ones. I really
Yeah.
struggled with ring slings and all the cloth ones.
Mhm.
I like never could figure this out. I had
Yeah.
one very small preemie baby and then I had one giant baby. And I like the ones with clips and I
Yeah.
like the ones we always got ones where we'd always look for one with a picture of a dad because I'm super tall and so I was
Yeah.
looking for the ones that were super tall. I wanted to have one that I could be able to breastfeed in. So I'm a giant. So for me, I like to have the extenders were really
Yeah.
great for me when I was looking for a baby carrier or one that could have an extender because even though it would fit me when I was wearing the baby tight and snug, I like to be
Mhm.
able to extend and slouch the baby down low so that I was able to put the baby to the breast while they were in the baby carrier. And
Yeah.
then they would be able to feed, fall asleep. And then I would tighten it back up and get the baby into a
Uh-huh.
comfortable position so that they could sleep on me, which was great, even not an emergency. I feel like,
Yeah. It's a game changer.
but
I did that all the time.
yeah. And I feel like right now, if you have a little one and you said, maybe you're not that interested in baby wearing, I would encourage you to go check it out. Usually the best place to find a baby carrier is at a new parents group and to be able to ask your friends, be like, hey, can you show me? And
Yeah.
there are baby wearing groups out there as well, but anywhere that you tend to see parents with babies, you can usually find somebody.
Mhm.
And if you're really lucky to find a group of parents, which I always advise anybody who's had a baby, wherever you birth, like run down the hallway and like grab people and grab some phone numbers and be like,
Yeah, I love that.
I need to know your name, I need to know your phone number, to find a
Yeah.
group of other people who have children the age of your children so that you can learn from them bigger than an emergency. I think it is really important to think about having people's contact information, especially in an emergency. An actual phone number is great because if you only knew people's social media handles in the
Yeah.
emergency when internet was slow and phones didn't work very well, email addresses and social media handles weren't working. The only thing we could get to work were phones, and mostly it was only texting, and even a phone call
Yeah.
wasn't able to work. And that's the way we were able to stay connected. And so I'd say the other piece of advice I would have for families to prepare for an emergency is to build your community, build your relationships with other people who have similar things happening to you and know their actual real life phone numbers.
Yeah, yeah. That's such good advice because we are such in a social media world, and so everyone is. I I I have so many friends on Facebook, and you're absolutely correct. I don't know how many of those people I actually have their phone numbers for. Like I could reach out on Facebook, but if we didn't have internet, then that would be useless.
Right.
So that's really, really good advice. Okay, so this is kind of more of like a local community idea, but is there anything that local communities could do to kind of help support that emergency preparedness for parents and infants?
I would say one of our goals is to make sure that everybody in every, at least two people in every health department have taken some type of training on infant and young child feeding in emergencies. We probably will take our safe infant feeding and turn it virtual, and it may exist one day. But right now, if you're not able to attend our training in Western North Carolina, I would say to look at the American Red Cross or UNICEF. They have some short trainings. Your local, our in North Carolina, our WIC offices have put together some recordings of some trainings, and the Carolina Global Breastfeeding Institute has. So just make sure that you've done 1 or 2 hours on safe infant feeding and in emergencies, and make sure that it's not one, but at least two
Yeah,
people in your department. And you're just thinking about when you review your emergency preparedness plan, have you thought about parents and young children? Have you thought about children under the age of 3 and where they're going to go and how they're going to be? A lot of times we forget to think about babies and to again think about not just providing formula, but remembering that breastfeeding is the safest option and that we want to support and protect breastfeeding when it's been able to be initiated, because it is vulnerable when we have new babies. All of us, I've never met a perfect parent. I've only met people who feel insecure about their parenting skills. And whenever a healthcare professional offers a successfully lactating family a can of formula, the usually parents feel like, oh my gosh, am I doing something wrong? Did you give this to me for a reason? And when that baby is crying, maybe because you're freaked out because you just lost your house. And
yeah,
babies tend to cry when parents are freaked out, not
yeah,
because they're cold or they're hungry, just because their parents are upset. You might
yeah.
say, think to yourself, oh, this baby is hungry. I'm not producing enough. I need to supplement, which would be the opposite of the best thing that you could do for that baby. If you have been able to successfully induce lactation, continuing to feed your baby at the breast is absolutely the safest thing you can do. And if you're co-feeding, being able to add one more breastfeeding opportunity is the safest thing that you can do. And if you're formula feeding, say it's okay.
Yeah,
Like I did the
yeah,
best I could. This is where we are. I'm going to make sure that these infant feeding supplies stay clean and safe.
yeah,
And maybe the next baby, maybe I'll be able to learn about breastfeeding with the next baby, or maybe I can promote or support my friend, my cousin, my family member, so that if they're able to breastfeed, I can say, "Good job."
yeah, yeah. That's so, and like there's such a emotional aspect to that as well of like, feeling like a failure even though you're not. And so that's really, really good advice. Okay, so if there is a crisis and you're struggling to feed your baby, what are the immediate steps they should take?
I would say, if you're a breastfeeding family, put the baby to the breast. I would say I always like to think of it more as appetizers rather than meals.
Mhm.
If you're one of
Yeah.
those people where you're watching the clock and you're saying, well, this baby's only supposed to eat every 3 hours, I would say put the baby to the breast as much as you possibly can, as early and often, because that's going to help regulate temperature. It's going to give an additional immune building. And sometimes babies eat more or get fussy or cry because they do have some sort of immune system thing going on. And sometimes that I had really kids who started turking really early, and I kept nursing until they were toddlers. And I remember when I got pregnant with my second, I was still nursing my first, and I had morning sickness. I kept throwing up, and my little guy who's 18 months old, he'd say, "Mommy, I think we should nurse. It will make you feel better." And
Oh, wow. I
and
love that
really,
so
right.
much.
And I mean, he said it in 18-month garbled baby
Yeah.
talk, but he was like,
Yeah.
we should nurse to make you feel better. That's how babies see the world. We should nurse. It
Yeah.
will make my parent, feel better because it makes me feel better as the baby.
Yeah.
So they think it's going to make you feel better. So any kind of trauma, they're going to want to nurse. And
Yeah.
I think the same thinking is true if you are a formula feeding parent, that you have to be really mindful that you're going to have a crying, fussy baby whose instinct is going to be to want to suck a lot. And so you're going to have to be really mindful about keeping track of those ounces so that you don't overfeed your baby. That just
Yeah.
because they're crying doesn't mean they're hungry. It can mean that they're scared. And so
Yeah.
being able to hold them and put them skin to skin as much as possible. So I always talk about how there's a lot of pieces of breastfeeding, and one of them is the milk that comes through your body, but there's a whole lot of other pieces of breastfeeding that you can do, even if you're not feeding breast milk. And holding the baby at breast or chest level, making eye contact while you're feeding the baby slowly, doing lots of skin to skin, touching them, hold them, talking to them, and just know that maybe they're crying because you're scared. And I feel like that it's kind of one of the curses of being the parent, because you're like, what would really make me feel better would be if you stopped crying.
Yeah. Exactly. That is so true. Yeah. Wow, that's really good advice. And that's where the baby carrier would come in so handy of that, of just like, you're right, if they want to be held the whole time, having your hands free with a baby carrier would be so beneficial.
Right. And I think about some of my friends when I say that out loud. I'm like, there's somebody out there who has some sort of postpartum challenge where they're like, I can't lift to over my
Yeah.
baby's 25 pounds and I'm not allowed to lift them. I have a postpartum thing where I'm not able to baby wear. And I would just say that one of the best things to do in that case is to think about other people in your life and if they're able to wear a baby carrier, maybe your
Oh,
partner or grandma or auntie, just making sure that somebody has access to be able to do that. So if there was an emergency, you were able to put that baby someplace safe. And I also would think about one of the things I really thought, once my kids could walk, they didn't need a baby carrier anymore. And one of my greatest regrets, because my kids are older now, is I wish I had really upgraded and gotten that bigger size, because even until age 3, if we were, I mean, it's not an emergency, but if we're at the fair, the last thing
yeah.
I want my child is to run around touching everything. Like, do not touch the animal and then try to eat, right?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. My daughter is that. She's 3 and she is the same way. And so, yes, I totally get where that comes from.
Yes. Um, and so I would say that um, no matter what you have going on in your life, if you are a kind of thinking about how you might want to carry your baby so that you could keep them safe, whether you're going to the fairgrounds or if there was an emergency, just how would you do that? Because you can
Yeah.
imagine a stroller doesn't work very well when the roads have been washed out.
Any final words of encouragement or key takeaways for parents preparing for emergencies before we wrap this up?
I think I think my takeaway would be to relax and not to over prepare for an emergency. I think that the biggest challenges that you're going to face as a parent are the everyday, and things like keeping around brushes and bleach and soap to be able to wash infant feeding supplies rather than thinking about that as an emergency preparedness and everyday preparedness. My kids' sippy cups and water bottles get gross all the time. And since I learned
Amen.
about this, I was like, wow, I never really thought about bleaching my kids' water bottles because I'm one of those natural mamas with I was like,
Mhm.
oh, we've got vinegar, it's fine. Well, I mean, the great thing about bleach, if it's 100% pure bleach with no additives, it can't have a thickener or a perfume. It has to be just plain, regular, traditional bleach. But the great thing about that is if you wash your items and you let them sit until they dry in the air, the bleach will break down to a salt compound. So you don't have to worry about that. And definitely if I'm seeing a sippy cup or a water bottle where it's starting to get that black mold on it, I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, I think I should be bleaching it.
Yeah.
And I leave that to your discretion. But just thinking about, rather than thinking about how I could prepare for the emergency, thinking about the benefits of bringing those preparedness items in every day, making sure that we're all getting access to clean water and clean food supplies, making sure that I built a network with my friends and I actually know their real phone numbers. That's a good idea all the time. Making sure I know how to carry my kids until they're actually able to not only walk, but make confident decisions so that when I tell them no or that they're not supposed to do something, that they actually can listen. Although I have a teenager, he's taller than me. I can't carry him
It's a whole
anymore.
nother thing.
So within reason.
Yeah, exactly.
But no matter how old your kids are, working on those
Yeah.
communication skills with your kids so that you can start to communicate with them. So when you say no, that they respect the no, and so you save it and you don't overuse it, and you're honest with your kids. In our family, it's not for an emergency, but we have a special loud clap because my son has hearing loss, and so it's a sustained clap with a pattern. And my kids know that when I do that clap, they come to me and I mean it. But they don't come when their dad claps. And I'm like, that's because you have abused the clap. When I clap, it means come to me right now and we're ready to transition. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean come to me right now and I'm going to spend 5 more minutes talking with my girlfriend before I'm ready to
Yeah.
go. When I
Yeah.
do the clap, I'm ready to go. So however you're communicating with your kids, no matter what their age is, when you're talking about emergency preparedness, you got to follow through with them. If you
Yeah.
say this is the sound of firm emergency, I mean it, then when they get to you, it has to be firm emergency, I mean it, so that you're training them to be ready to go.
That's such great advice. I'm so glad. I'm gonna try to implement that in my own family
Yeah.
because my 5-year-old, almost 6-year-old, he listens pretty well, but my 3-year-old, whew, whew.
Right. And in our family, when I do the clap, I mean, and it works at the museum, if we're like at a place with a lot of water, they can hear it. And if you don't come during the clap, then there's a consequence that I always follow through on. And my kids know what that consequence is. It usually involves no screens for my
Yes,
children.
absolutely. Oh my gosh, I love that. Wow, I have learned so much through this interview. Thank you so much, love, for coming on here and talking with us. Like, I am so grateful for you and the time and energy and expertise that you have brought to this. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
Yeah.